Hey guys, this is Dylan from Crypto Minded, and today I'd like to explain to you how I do cryptocurrency accounting, and that means invoicing in, for example, Bitcoin, Ethereum, or Litecoin, and also that means like basically accounting for all the transactions, incoming and outgoing transactions that you do using cryptocurrencies. Now, I have looked at solutions like Xero, QuickBooks, and a bunch of others, but unfortunately all of them do not yet support cryptocurrencies. So I set up Airtable, which is essentially a glorified spreadsheet, super simple to use, but it does need some explanation of how I use it. So I would like to share that with you guys today so that you as a cryptocurrency entrepreneur know how to account for your cryptocurrency payments and incoming transactions, and do everything above the table and pay your taxes. Unfortunately, we still have to do that. So, all right, let's get started. I'll dive right in, and let's do it. Hi everyone. So we are here at the computer, and I have Airtable already open. So here I wanted to show you how I am using Airtable. So as you can see, we have 4 different tabs: expenses, which are the outgoing payments; invoices, which are the incoming payments; transactions, and my accounts. So I will walk through them step for step and then explain you how I set up a particular transaction and how I add in information. So the expenses, which are my outgoing payments, are all listed here. So I list the receiver of the payment. For example, Alex, my designer, the accounting provider. I tell which date they actually sent me the invoice, which month that was. There's probably, you can make a formula out of this, but I do it manually still. Then I write a note, so what was the payment for? And then I upload the PDF. So here I can actually upload documents. So I can just select a document here, drag and drop it into Airtable, and I just take the invoice that they gave me, upload it here, and then when I click on it, I can actually immediately see the invoice. So I'm not going to show you that invoice, but you get the idea. Then what I do is I specify the transaction currency. So of course, some invoices are paid in euros or USD, and some others are paid in Ethereum, Bitcoin, Litecoin, whatever currencies you prefer, as long as this is one of the main currencies. That's kind of like my mantra, like you should stick with either like Ethereum, Bitcoin, or Litecoin for the transactions, just because they are market priced and they are widely supported. If you are invoicing in tokens, which are from particular startups like ICOs, it can become a little bit tricky because they set the price for the token and not the market, especially when it's not a traded token yet. So I recommend sticking to traded cryptocurrencies that have widely available pricing data on CoinMarketCap, but also websites like xe.com or investing.com. So I only invoice in Ethereum or Bitcoin, or only transact in Ethereum and Bitcoin. Now, I selected Ethereum. Here I have my related transaction, which we'll get to in a second, and the value of the payment. Then we have our invoices, which are incoming transactions, meaning we send out those invoices and we get money for those, hopefully. I specify the client, I specify the date on which I did the invoice and the month, so that we can later easily group it by month, so that when we give it to our accountant, they can see, okay, these were all the transactions in that particular month, and they don't have to like weed through all of it. Invoice status is created, sent, overdue, or paid. So this way I track whether they have actually paid or sent the invoice. If you want to create a due date, you can automatically create a formula to set this selection automatically. Then I upload again my invoice PDF. So here I have a PDF. Again, I'm not going to show you the actual PDF because it's an actual invoice I send out. But basically, like, that is how I then upload the PDF, so that I have the proof that I actually send out that PDF. The transaction and the value. This should actually be a transaction currency. I'm missing one particular field here, but Essentially, just like expenses outgoing, there should be a transaction currency, because again, I can invoice in US dollars, euros, Ethereum, Bitcoin, etc. And we need to eventually calculate that back into a euro value, because I am paying my taxes in euros. If you're living in the US, you might pay your taxes in US dollars, or most likely pay your taxes in US dollars. So you have to convert those values back to US dollars on the day that the transaction happened. So then I have the transactions that I'm doing and that are incoming. So here I basically explain the transaction time and date that is not necessarily equal to the invoice time and date, the transaction currency from which account it happened. So if it comes from an account of mine, I just select it here. And I basically select one of my accounts. So I have business accounts here and I have personal accounts in case I pay a transaction using my personal account. Then I have the receiving account. So the receiving account is the address or the bank address of the person receiving your payment. Don't worry, this is a randomized Ethereum account, so you won't actually be able to do anything with it. Then I upload my transaction ID if I'm doing a cryptocurrency payment. So that's just the Etherscan link. And on the Etherscan link, which is an open ledger, right? Ethereum is an open ledger. Basically, the accountant can see, or the tax office can see, that the transaction actually happened, was valid, what time it happened, etc. If I'm doing a transaction in fiat, usually you don't necessarily need to upload any proof for that, but I do. Especially if I'm paying from a personal account, I will just upload a PDF or a screenshot of that payment. And then we have the transaction type. So if it's an outgoing transaction, I will put outgoing, and if it's an incoming transaction, I will put incoming. All right, so let's create a new transaction and show you guys exactly how. Oh wait. All right, so and then the next step is the account step. So the account step allows you to basically get an overview of all the accounts where the transactions are happening. So I basically split up my business and personal accounts. So as you can see, I have designated 2 Ethereum addresses to my business accounts. So these are business Ethereum accounts. So I can only use them for business purchases or business income. And you will have to account for it. So you have to explain everything that you do. So make sure that you designate a specific address for that and keep it specifically only for that purpose. I just noted where I'm actually storing those addresses or where those addresses are located. And then I have my bank accounts, like my traditional bank accounts for euros, US dollars, etc. Again, don't worry, these addresses are personalized or are randomized, so you won't actually be able to do anything with it. Now, I also have personal accounts in there in case I pay at a shop using my personal account. For example, I'm doing expenses on a business trip. I have my credit card, my Ethereum accounts in there, etc. Unfortunately, I've been using a lot of my personal accounts because I have not received my bank cards yet. So yeah, that's why that's in there. All right, so for those guys that are still following along and find this interesting, let me give you guys an example of how I'm actually inputting transactions into Airtable so that you can do it yourself as well. So for the sake of this example, let's just say that this is an expense. So an outgoing transaction, we send money to them. And we're going to do that in Bitcoin. So they send us an invoice in Bitcoin. So what we're going to do here is specify the receiver of the transaction, specify the date on which they send us the invoice. So they send us the invoice on the 8th of December. So here we're going to specify December as the month. And in this case, the invoice is still open, meaning we have not yet paid the invoice. We say payment for receiver 1 services, just for the example here. And then we take the PDF invoice that they send us. So I mean, everyone is required to send you an invoice. You just upload it here and then you have the proof of the invoice as well in there. Transaction currency is Bitcoin. And then we have the related transaction, which we'll get to in a second. And we have the value. So they invoiced us for 0.5 Bitcoin. Curious what services it were, but yeah, 0.5 Bitcoin. Now, let's imagine that we actually pay the invoice. So we're gonna create a transaction. So we now have just put in the invoice into the system, and every Wednesday morning, for example, I pay the invoices and I specify all the transactions that I did. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna set the status to paid. And here I'm gonna take the related transaction and I'm gonna create a new transaction. So I'm gonna click the plus sign and then click add new record. So now a screen pops up, and here I'm gonna put receiver one transaction example, just to give the transaction a description. I specify what day and what date essentially I did the transaction. So I'm doing this transaction on the 11th of December, and I did it at 11:30 a.m. So the time is not necessary per se, but I'm just putting it in just to make sure. The transaction value was 0.5 Bitcoin, and I type in the currency as Bitcoin, and I then specify the account from which I did the transaction. So in this case, I actually do not have a Bitcoin address in my accounts list. So for the sake of this example, I just click on an Ethereum account. So here you would actually select the Bitcoin address that you sent the transaction from. We specify the receiving account or client, or we just specify their Bitcoin address. So whatever a Bitcoin address looks like, I think that's what an Ethereum address looks like actually. But yeah, you specify their Bitcoin address here. Transaction ID is very simple. So on the Bitcoin blockchain, on the Ethereum blockchain, on the Litecoin blockchain, there are blockchain explorers that allow you to see the transaction. So here I just took an example from blockchain info. And basically this is a transaction that happened on the blockchain. And let's just imagine that this was our particular transaction, the one that we sent to the receiver. Then we just take the URL and we input it here, a transaction ID, so that we can actually prove that the transaction happened, that it was a valid transaction that happened on the blockchain. Then what we're going to do, if we have did a transaction in fiat, we are going to upload the proof of that. So a bank transfer screenshot or anything like that. But in this case, the transaction was in Bitcoin. And then we specify the transaction type. So in this case, it's an outgoing transaction. And then we're done. So I just close the screen and there we go. We now have our invoice paid. And if you go to transactions, you'll see that the transaction is in there, the transaction time and date, the transaction value, etc., from which account you did it. And now, so basically when you give this to the accountant, what they can do is they can just see, okay, well, the transaction value was 0.5 Bitcoin. You did the transaction on the 11th of December. So we're going to go to xe.com. We're going to select 11 December in historical rates. And then we take, okay, this was the exchange rate between euros and Bitcoin. So you paid 0.5 Bitcoin, which then equals 6,911 euros. And so this is what they give to the accounting or the tax office as the value of the transaction. So if you are having to do VAT, for example, or you have to tax your income, this is how you can transact it or change it back to your base currency, and basically have your base currency as an example. So that's how I input a transaction. The next step that I want to show you guys is how I actually invoice someone. Apologies for that noise. So how I actually invoice someone. So how do I make up an invoice? How do I specify the cryptocurrencies on there? How do I specify the base currency on there? And how then I put that invoice into Airtable as well. So let me get to that right now. All right, so here we are, and I have my invoice in front of me. And basically, some of you may recognize what software I'm using here. So I'm using Sketch to actually make the invoice. Now, Sketch is somewhat like Photoshop. And the reason I'm using Sketch is because I've looked at solutions like Xero, QuickBooks, or any other invoicing solution that allows you to create invoices, but none of them support listing a base currency and a cryptocurrency on the invoice, which is required in my case. In Europe, you are required to also list the base currency. So let me quickly run you through this invoice and I'll explain all the different elements to it, and then how I do the currency conversions and put it into Airtable. So basically what I do is, here I have my logo, my address, very standard. I have the recipient of the invoice details like the invoice code, the invoice date, and the payment terms. And then I have my products and services that I sold to that particular client or customer. So I have, in this case, sold the community ICO analysis. Quantity was 1. The price was 505. And the amount was 505 because it's only one quantity. Now, you may see that I have listed Ethereum below this. Now, as I mentioned, like, I'm supposed to have a base currency. My base currency is euros. I pay my taxes in euros. I have to declare my VAT in euros, etc. So I always use euros as my base currency. That doesn't mean I can't receive transactions in Ethereum, but it means that the value of the invoice or the product is in euros. Now, what I do is I just take that amount on the date that I create the invoice, so 505, and I go to this website called investing.com. You can also use CoinMarketCap, but I tend to send people to websites where it's a little bit more broadly financial, just so that the accountants and the tax office feels a little bit more comfortable with it. But so what I do is I go to Ethereum Euro, and there's here general currency converter. So I switch those around and I type in 505, and it returns me that is €1.30, or 1 Ethereum 30, sorry. So here I would then put in 130. Then what I do is I charge the VAT percentage. So if I'm invoicing within Europe, the VAT total, the total amount without VAT, including VAT, and then the total price including VAT in Ethereum. So that is the amount that they have to end up paying me. And as you saw above, that is actually 1.3 Ethereum. Now this part is very important. So as you can see, I added a note here. And that note says this invoice is to be paid in Ethereum equal to the euro value on the day of payment. That means that even though I specify 1.3 Ethereum on the invoice, that might not be the actual amount that they end up paying. It's just a reference right now. So if the price fluctuates over time and they pay the invoice 7 days later, then what happens is they actually end up paying me the invoice in the Ethereum value of that day. So 505 euros. They basically do the same thing. Go to investing.com, put in the euro value, and it might have changed. So it might have changed to 1.2 Ethereum, right? And so basically they pay me 1.2 Ethereum and I still receive 505 euros. Then what I give as well is my payment details. In this case, that is an Ethereum address. So I specify my Ethereum address, my public key, and I mention just please allocate enough Gwei for the transaction, so the transaction goes through. One other thing I do, and this is purely for my accountants when they have to do currency conversions, is I specify exactly what currency conversion rate I used on the invoice when I created this particular invoice. So I specify please ensure to pay the invoice within 30 days, and we thank you for your business, blah blah blah. And then I specify the Ethereum/euro rate on invoice is €1 is 0.0032 Ethereum, and the source of that exchange rate is investing.com at this particular date and this particular time. So then if the accountants need to do currency conversions, that they understand exactly where those conversions are coming from and what rates I took. So yeah, basically that's how I make up an invoice. I then send this to the person that has to pay me, and what they do is they just take the euro amount and pay me the value of that euro amount on the day that they actually do the transaction. So what I do in Airtable is I then go to invoices. I specify the invoice. So this invoice was for client John Doe. I made the invoice on the 11th of December. So I select December here. The invoice status is sent. I uploaded the PDF document I created. And then we have the transaction again here. So here I put in the euro value. And there we have the transaction. Now, basically, once they pay the invoice, we are gonna change the invoice status to paid, and we're gonna add the transaction here. So we're gonna go and add a new record. Receiving payment from John Doe, and they paid me the invoice on the 13th of December. The transaction value was 0.9 Ethereum. Now this is important because basically I need to specify what was the transaction value and what was the transaction currency. And as you can see on the invoice, I specified 1.3, but by the time they paid me, the value of Ethereum has gone up compared to the euros. And so they actually ended up paying me only not 0.9 Ethereum, because that was 505 euros. I then specify what account I received it from. This might be, should just be a field instead of like one of those relation tables, so that I can specify it came from them. And then I received it into one of my accounts. The transaction ID basically is what I use to show that the transaction actually happened. So I could go to Etherscan and then look up the transaction. So just to give you an example, this is a transaction that happened. I take that transaction ID, go to accounting, insert that, and then I can show that the transaction actually happened, that the money was received on my account, that the money was exactly 0.9 Ether. And then basically we can prove that we received that money, and we can prove to the tax office that we are the real owners of that money and that it was not whitewashing, because we specified our Ethereum address on that invoice. And so they can exactly link that Ethereum address to that amount of euros on that transaction ID and transaction date. And so we can explain all of those transactions. So once we actually start doing payments with that money, then we can specify like, well, this is where it came from. Must those questions ever arise? And that's it. And that's how I insert my payment. And then basically what I do is I send this to my accountant, and they will take care of all the rest, like the currency conversions and the tax filings. All right, thank you guys for sticking around and watching that. I hope you found it helpful. I know that was a very long video, but I wanted to go over everything in detail. So yeah, if you have any suggestions on how I could improve my workflow, or if you have any questions about the workflow, let me know. I'm more than happy to answer it, or even make a video in the future of my updated workflow from your suggestions. Also, if you want to use the Airtable base that I'm using in the video, just click on the description below in the YouTube description. I attached a link so you can just start from that base and you don't have to create everything from scratch. If you find these videos helpful and you would like me to make more videos for cryptocurrency entrepreneurs, let me know as well. Like, subscribe, whatever. And yeah, it would be amazing if I could get some feedback on that. I enjoy making these videos, but I want to make sure that they're helpful for you as well. All right, wish you all the best, and up to the next video. Bye-bye.